Market Journal, television for agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine.
Hello everyone, I'm Troy Moling and thanks for joining us today on Market Journal. Happy to be back with you this week, and thanks to Bill Dodd for holding down the fort while I was out. Last week I was in Portland, Oregon with a contingent from the Nebraska Wheat Board. We were hosted by the state's Wheat Marketing Center, and the purpose for our trip was to show producers and people who work in the wheat industry what happens after the wheat leaves the farm. We did that by touring transportation hubs, grain terminals, a local bakery, and the WMC's Wheat Innovation Lab. And at each stop, we got to see how Nebraska wheat is making its mark on the industry and learned a lesson to take back home.
The export facility up on the river was very informative for me, being a grain merchandiser. That's, if we load a shuttle train out of one of our facilities, that's more than likely where it's going to go if it's loaded with wheat. And so I'm definitely going to share some information about that.
I think one of the coolest things is in agriculture, you always hear that agriculture feeds all of these other jobs and all of these other industries. And you really got to see that come together and play a part while we were out here in Oregon, because we talked to the barge people, and they mentioned how there's over 1,000 workers that work at a barge terminal, but you never get to see that because all those people are behind the scenes. That's just like in the agriculture industry. You might see one or two people out on the farm, but you never see the people who are behind that process and everything that happens after that wheat product leaves the farm.
And it's becoming more specialized. We're not in a commodity business anymore, although it seems like it some days from our end. We're in a kind of a tailored, specialized food business.
In some upcoming shows, we're going to dig even deeper into some of the things we learned on this trip, so make sure you stay tuned for that. In the meantime, if you're interested in joining the Nebraska Wheat Board on any future tours, reach out to them. We've got their information on the Market Journal website. Next up, sometimes a producer's greatest challenges aren't bad weather or market uncertainty, but finding quality workers for their farming operation. Mike Briggs, feedlot manager at Briggs Feed Yard in Seward, says he's got a core of employees that have been with him for several years, but not everyone is that fortunate. Still, having a full crew has been an issue for him too.
It just gets harder and harder and harder. We spend more and more dollars for advertising. Advertising gets more expensive, and we've tried all kinds of things. We've tried print, we've tried the internet, and it's just unbelievably hard to find employees. Now, I think there's a lot of reasons behind that. One, you've got a really low unemployment rate, so everybody has a job. But the other thing, and like I try to point out to people, agriculture's a different deal. It's really close to actual work, where, you know, some other stuff maybe not so much. Plus, your hours are longer, there's weekends involved, and today's individual, millennials, really don't like that. And you know, I'd rather not work weekends too, but it's part of the gig, so you have to be willing to do that. Now, there's still some people that like to work outside, but it seems to be becoming fewer and fewer.
It's important to remember that being a boss with strong communication skills and the know-how to work with different personalities can help in lessening turnover rate.
I've had to learn myself differently how to handle people and train people, because well, we've talked about it before. As you go through time, population becomes more and more urban and less rural. These guys that come out here have never been exposed to this stuff. And that's an issue, is that more people are coming from urban areas out to rural areas to get jobs. They've got no clue. So you've really got to start slow and start from the ground level. So that makes it a challenge too. And you have to understand that.
Mike told us he posts for jobs online, in the newspaper, and at local trade schools. He's also careful about which employees he lets work around livestock, leaving that to more experienced people on the crew. Time to see what's making news in the markets this week. My guest is Dr. Derrell Peel. He's a livestock marketing specialist with Oklahoma State University Extension. Thanks for being here, Derrell.
You bet.
So starting off, Friday, January 10th was a big day for USDA reports. Share with us a few of the big items from the data that was released.
Well, it was a big day. We're still trying to figure out exactly what happened in 2019 with these crops, and we got closer with these reports. These were supposed to be the final numbers for crop production. They're really not quite probably. USDA is still trying to assess some of these unharvested corn acres and those kind of things, but we're getting closer. And I think from a producer standpoint, we'd really like to sort of put 2019 behind us and think about the new year.
Yeah, and since we have had some time to digest those reports, where do you see the focus headed now in the markets for 2020?
Well, I think right now all eyes are on the trade situation, and obviously we're trying to finalize several trade things right now. We get USMCA finalized, hopefully. That will remove some uncertainty that's surrounded that issue. We hopefully have the phase one China trade deal, which will certainly be supportive to soybean markets, but really more broadly than that, probably a number of agricultural markets. So I think that's where the initial focus is, and then that's going to in turn set up for crop producers pretty quickly considerations of just what this means for their for their planting intentions, particularly from a corn and soybean standpoint in the Midwest.
And moving over to cattle, does it look like producers in that sector can go into 2020 with maybe a bit more clarity than what we were going into on 2019?
I do. The trade situation is also better from a livestock and meat standpoint. And in general, I think things look pretty promising from a cattle industry standpoint. We're waiting. It'll be a little bit yet before we have the final USDA numbers, I should say the January 1 USDA numbers on cattle inventories. But we think those numbers are pretty stable. And so that sets up a slightly more supportive supply situation. Not that production is going to go down, but it won't continue to increase like it has. And combine that with the demand, and again, the trade picture looks a little more promising, enhancing demand from that component.
And Derrell, let me also get a question in here about live and feeder markets. How are things positioned right now, and what advice can you share for the producers watching?
Well, again, we've seen a nice run up towards the end of 2019. We had some struggles kind of in the middle of the year, or the third quarter of 2019. Finished the year on a pretty strong note, and it looks like we're carrying that through here into 2020. So there's some opportunities here. Producers, both live cattle as well as feeder cattle, probably we can be kind of optimistic and carry that forward. At the same time, you probably want to look at some pricing opportunities. I wouldn't forget the idea that we maybe need a little bit of risk management. There's still plenty of opportunities for these markets to be a little bit volatile. So certainly you want to pay attention to opportunities that are presented in the marketplace.
And let's talk about beef challenges for 2020. What do you see on that end?
Well, again, we're overall pretty positive. Beef demand looks pretty strong, particularly the trade side. Domestic, so far so good. We kind of said that for most of last year as well, but it looks perhaps even a little more positive this year. Obviously, one of the bigger wild cards, I suppose, is just the fact that it's a presidential election year. We're going to continue to see some volatility and some uncertainty in the markets relative to some of those issues. We're not out of the woods with all of these trade issues yet, so we're going to keep an eye on that going forward. And if you throw in some, geopolitical tensions in the Middle East, which, come and go, but they could flare up and be a bigger deal, impacting, say, energy values or currency values, all of those things are things we have to keep an eye on.
And then African swine fever, another issue we'll continue to track into 2020. Now, this is something that's been in the news cycle for a while. Impacts from this disease still aren't fully understood, though, right?
Well, they're not. I mean, it's a very dynamic situation. We don't know exactly where we're at, and the biggest part of that, of course, is in China. They did lose a lot of production in 2019. They will see decreased production in 2020. Maybe we don't know the exact magnitude, but the bottom line is there's less meat on the planet right now than there was this time a year ago, and that's going to be supportive to all protein markets. Obviously, the focus is on pork initially from a China standpoint and broadly from a global standpoint, but it really spills over into the other meats as well. There's certainly some underpinning support here for all protein markets in 2020.
And finally, Derrell, the first cattle on feed report of 2020 coming out next week. What do we need to be paying attention with that report?
Well, I think we're going to see, probably a decent marketings number. Placements will probably be a little bit higher than a year ago. So we're maintaining that overall feedlot inventory that's about 2% above a year ago. It's not continuing to get bigger, and I think over the next few months we'll start to see that feedlot inventory shrink a little bit on a year-over-year basis as we work through these peak feeder cattle supplies, but we're probably not quite there yet. We've still got a couple of months to go.
All right, Dr. Derrell Peel, thanks for being here with us today. Always good to talk to you.
You bet, anytime.
CVA's Luke Beckman will be our guest next week. Moving on, and on February 14th, 2019, the Trump administration proposed new rules defining what constitutes waters of the U.S., or WOTUS, that are business and farmer friendly. Dave Aiken, UNL Extension Water and Agricultural Law Specialist, joined the program to discuss WOTUS and what it means for ag.
Waters of the United States, or WOTUS, is waters that are subject to regulation under the Federal Clean Water Act. And specifically, it's been most controversial when it has been applied to wetlands.
And who is required to obtain a Section 404 permit as it relates to WOTUS?
Well, typically it would be a real estate developer or a land developer that takes undeveloped land like farmland or ranch land and then converts it to residential or commercial property, something like that. And if there is any waters of the United States on the land to be developed, and if they're wetlands, for example, then before they can fill the wetlands, they have to agree to replace with new wetlands. Only 1.5 times as many acres are being filled. So if you're filling 20, you have to replace 30 acres. And that can drive up the cost of the project as well as make the project take longer to implement because you've got to go through the environmental stuff.
And what's the effect of that 404 program on farmers or people in the ag industry?
Well, typically, most of the wetland issues have been handled through the Swamp Buster program. That's part of the farm program. Occasionally, however, if a farmer is trying to bring land into production, they may get into an issue in terms of whether that's wetlands, whether it's prior converted to wetlands and this type of thing, and so it may end up being a 404 issue. But hopefully there's not as many for farmers who are just farming. Once it's converted to a non-farming, a non-agricultural use, then 404 usually can jump right in.
And what specifically would the proposed WOTUS regulations do?
Well, Troy, it would significantly reduce the amount of land that is subject to 404 regulation or 404 protection, depending on however you want to look at it. The big thing is that wetlands, in order to be considered waters of the United States, would need to have a direct surface link to a river or stream. And if they don't have that direct surface connection, like draining directly into the river or something like that, or through a channel, and most don't, then they would be outside of the 404 program and outside of the clean water protection.
Do you know of any specific places in Nebraska that have the potential to be impacted?
Well, in the past, anything that was, any ground that was wet, either part of the year or maybe even all the year, would be potentially subject to 404. But that could be anywhere.
Okay, so next steps for wildlife groups or environmental groups who are opposed to this. What's their next step?
Well, they're very unhappy with this because a lot of the habitat protection would go away with this proposal under the Clean Water Act. And so as soon as these proposed rules become final, they will take it to court, and then it could be 2, 3, 4 years before it gets to the Supreme Court and we get a final answer.
So no concrete date as to when this could be resolved?
Well, this has gone back almost 10 years, back to some Supreme Court decisions. And so it's been, the Obama administration proposed regulations. Those have been tied up in court. The Trump administration came in with their own, and they will suffer the same fate.
To wrap up, if farmers have any questions about how they may be impacted or WOTUS in general, what can they do?
Well, if they have any questions regarding wetlands, they can contact either their local natural resource district or go to their local NRCS office.
Thanks to Dave for being here. Next up, mental health in agriculture and rural areas has been a big topic in recent years, and for good reason. While not the occupation with the highest risk of suicide, farming is consistently listed among the top 20. Traditionally, farmers and ranchers are resilient, self-reliant, and optimistic most of the time. However, that can also mean they're less likely to seek help when it comes to stress and mental health issues. That's why it's important for friends, family, and people working closely with them to understand how they can help those affected by stress and depression. In the January Nebraska Farmer, read about how you can help those who are impacted. It's time now for weather with Nebraska Extension Ag Climatologist and Market Journal Chief Meteorologist Al Dutcher. Al, this week we saw those colder temperatures you said we should expect. How's the upcoming week look for us?
Well, Troy, indeed, we did see the cold air, and unfortunately, most of the major systems that moved through the region, if you want to call them major, basically brought us just light traces of precipitation outside of the end of the week storm, of course. We talked about that last week, with the potential for a system moving into the Central Plains with a little bit more oomph to it, and that's exactly what we got. So we've seen the snow start to break out as we got into late Thursday at night into Friday morning. We've seen the warmer air come in behind it, change that snow over to a mixture of freezing rain, sleet, and back to snow as the cold front came through. Now we're dealing with the high winds as the heavier snowfall has moved off to our east. And so if we can get by this system, it looks like we're going to stay cold for a few days before we moderate in the middle of the week. And yet another system looks like it may start to impact the state as we get into late next week. So as we go to the upper air models, the first thing I'll draw your attention to is a system that is now responsible for bringing our snowfall, has moved over into the Great Lakes region. We do have a strong jet stream that is going to bring in some colder air into our region as high pressure settles in. We do have another wave that will be moving down the pipeline, but overall, most of the snow that's depicted by the GFS model is for this morning. Everything should be cleared out by the noon hour, and then we will look for another impulse of energy moving down this northerly flow with high pressure behind it on Sunday, giving us a shot of flurry activity and some very cold temperatures moving into the region. We'll be fortunate to reach the 20-degree mark as we get into the Sunday-Monday time frame with that cold air settling in. By Monday, we start to see some relief in western Nebraska as the ridge tries to build northward. Low pressure forms in northeastern Colorado, but there's just no moisture for it to work with as this high pressure is blocking the movement of moisture northward. With that impulse coming through eastern Nebraska, just a slight chance of some flurry activity, nothing major to work about. And on Tuesday, we get a little wave that moves to our south. This may bring some cloudiness to southern Nebraska, maybe some slight chances for precipitation, but nothing major, as low pressure in the Texas Panhandle just doesn't have enough time to bring moisture into our region. The main emphasis of the story is in the western United States as a big upper air low moves in. By Wednesday, the GFS model brings it all the way into the southwestern desert. Might be just a little bit too fast, but if it is verified, we will see low pressure developing the Texas Panhandle or somewhere near there, starting to pump moisture up into our region on Wednesday. Most of this looks like it's going to stay to the east of us as the core of the heavy precip means over the central Rockies. By Thursday, that low starts to make its way toward the Great Lakes. Surface low pressure is moving around this upper air low, will really feed the moisture toward the north, and we will see a pretty wide expanse of thunderstorm development and severe weather breakout to our south. We'll start to see snow filling in the northwest, and by Friday, that upper air low now moves into eastern Kansas with a surface low over southern Missouri. That's going to wrap a lot of moisture around this low pressure system, meeting up with this cold high coming on the backside. Looks like the perfect ingredient for a swath of pretty significant snowfall to potentially develop from south central through northeastern Nebraska. A little bit farther northwards placement of this system, and we'll see this back up more into the central part of the state. Further out, looking at colder than normal conditions to remain, primarily because of this impacts from next Thursday to the following Tuesday. Warm air to our west will try to start building in as we get toward the first of the month in terms of precipitation. Most of the depiction from next Thursday to the following Tuesday with this above normal is with this storm system. So it looks like an overall stormier pattern as we get into late next week, but there are signs of a warming trend coming as we enter into the month of February.
Thanks, Al. Next up, we've reached that point in the year where it's time to assess how you'll approach the upcoming planting season. 2019 came with its own set of challenges, and while some of the challenges lay firmly in the past, there are still many pest and crop diseases to be mindful of. This week, Market Journal's Bill Dodd is taking a look at developing research into soybean gall midge and crop diseases that producers should be looking to head off before planting begins. Bill, what have you got for us this week?
Thanks, Troy. You're absolutely right. 2019 hit many producers with a number of challenges. Now, two challenges that probably won't go away anytime soon are pests and crop disease. Now, one pest that gave headaches to both producers and researchers alike last season was the soybean gall midge. During the last growing season, there were 86 counties spread over 5 states that had documented infestations of soybean gall midge. While researchers didn't have a specific number for the amount of producers affected by this pest, UNL crop protection and cropping system specialist Dr. Justin McMechan says that further research into the pest has provided good data showing that the number of infestations didn't seem to be dropping. However, the damage done by the pest was far less worse in 2019 than 2018. While this is good news, Justin thinks that this pest will still be a problem for producers again in 2020.
We're on the higher end of risk in Nebraska for soybean gall midge. Iowa probably sits next to us in terms of risk and loss this past year. We identified it in Missouri, which was new for 2019. Minnesota saw a number of counties get highlighted, like 11 new counties in Minnesota, but the losses there are quite low and the level of injury that they're seeing is low. And then South Dakota had a very backwards year. They didn't get planted a lot till June. We saw some impacts from planting dates, so we can help kind of inform what happened in that state. They have impact, but it was a hard year for them for other reasons. So we tracked its adult emergence in the spring, which was the first time we've ever done that, so that was pretty key. And then we actually tracked 2 additional generations during the season, so now we know that there's 2 and a partial generation during the season. We got an understanding of time to impact and when we start to find larvae in the field, conducted a bunch of chemical and cultural control studies out there. So I feel like we're getting a handle, but I'm certain growers will still be frustrated this winter on what exactly to do as we come into the next season.
While research is ongoing and no fix-all solution has been pinpointed to this problem, Justin says there are some steps that can be taken in order to reduce the risk of infestation in your crop.
Yeah, if I was a farmer and I had significant impact from soybean gall midge, I would be looking at my operation saying, where did I have significant pressure last year? I would try and plant those fields last in my operation of planting for soybeans. Might want to consider a seed treatment, might want to consider a foliar. That's the level of risk that they're sitting at. The best thing they can do is get a hold of me and get on the alert system for adult monitoring so they know when to apply if they're going to make any management strategies. We have a lot of stuff. If somebody's interested in knowing, especially they're locally here in Nebraska, give me a call or send me an email and I can line them up with some of the projects we're doing on farm as well.
And while we're taking a look at problems producers were faced with in 2019, now's a good time to be thinking about plant disease prevention. We recently caught up with Nebraska Extension plant pathologist Dr. Tamra Jackson-Ziems. As she says, a big concern for those who face problems with plant disease is the fact that many of the pathogens that cause these issues will overwinter in the field.
When you look at diseases that people have had in their fields in corn or soybean or almost any crop, most of those are caused by pathogens that overwinter, and so there's always a chance that they're going to see those diseases again. And a lot of that does depend on weather conditions, but they can be prepared for that and use this time right now to select soybean varieties and corn hybrids that are more resistant to those varieties, and that'll help reduce disease severity in the future. And it may help them sometimes even prevent fungicide applications or other pesticides they need to manage it. May help reduce input costs that way.
Of the many diseases producers may battle in the coming months, Tamra says one of the main diseases Nebraska Extension is keeping a very close eye on is tar spot.
In 2019, we watched very closely as a fungal disease called tar spot moved most of the way across Iowa toward us. And in fact, those last couple of weeks of the season, late September, early October, we watched as it moved seemingly quite rapidly as our neighbors to the east confirmed it. And in fact, it has been confirmed within one county of the Missouri River. And it's likely it may even already be here in Nebraska at such a low incidence that we haven't found it yet. And this is a disease, tar spot. It's caused by a fungus that causes very small black dots on the leaves, and those are actually the fungal reproductive structures. That's what we hope people will start looking for in 2020, and I would start looking quite early. This fungus likes cooler temperatures in the 60s and 70s, and so you can even see that develop in seedling corn.
Now, Tamra did make it very clear that extreme cold will more than likely not kill off any pathogens that may be overwintering in your field. However, with the fluctuating temperatures we've experienced, it would be prudent to keep a close eye on stored grains, as these fluctuating temperatures could lead to mold growth. So Troy, we've definitely got plenty to keep our eye on as producers ramp up for their planting season. But for now, I'll send it back to you.
Thanks, Bill. Finally today, there are a couple different educational opportunities for producers to check out this month. While a farmer's work is never done, we have entered a portion of the season where things might be slowing down a bit. And if that's the case for you, Nebraska Extension's Weed Science School is an opportunity for producers to learn the latest information on subjects like herbicide-resistant weeds in Nebraska, dicamba off-target movement detection, and managing water hemp. You can earn CCA credits too. UNL Extension Weed Management Specialist Dr. Amit Jhala shares more.
Since now we have 6 weeds in Nebraska have evolved resistance to glyphosate and they are widespread, so it will be important not only for growers but also for crop consultants and extension educators, and anybody who is interested in agriculture and weed management will benefit by attending this one-day seminar.
Nebraska Extension Weed Science School takes place on Wednesday, January 29th from 8:30 a.m. to 4:30 p.m. at the Eastern Nebraska Research and Extension Center near Meade. The class is free to attend and lunch will be provided for attendees. Amit is requesting that you pre-register at least 24 hours in advance. You can do that online at go.unl.edu/Weed Science School. The info is on our website as well. And there's a unique opportunity for producers to seek free and confidential legal and financial advice in one-on-one meetings with an agricultural law attorney or ag finance counselor. There's a couple more chances to take advantage of this. One is in Norfolk on Wednesday, January 22nd, and then in Valentine, Nebraska on Thursday, January 23rd. To sign up for a free clinic or to get more information, call the Nebraska Farm Hotline at 1-800-464-0258. That's going to do it for this week's show. If you missed a story, be sure to download the Market Journal mobile app or follow us on social media to join in on the conversation. Next week, we'll examine how much money it took to produce a calf in 2019 and what that means for this year. Plus, Nebraska Extension Policy Specialist Brad Lubin shares some of the major challenges ag producers may be facing in 2020. Hope to see you right back here next time. I'm Troy Moling. Thanks for watching.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.